In this video, we're going to cover everything you need to know about neurons. So we're going to learn what they are, their characteristics, parts, classification, functions, and examples. So every thought, movement, sensation, and emotion in the human body begins with a simple, powerful unit, which is the neuron. They are microscopic structures that play a very major function in the nervous system. So they're responsible for relaying information, coordinating actions, and allowing the brain to interact with the outside world. So, what exactly is a neuron? A neuron is a nerve cell that sends messages all over your body and allows you to do everything. So, when you breathe, when you talk, when you eat, walk, and think, it's all thanks to the neuron. Neurons are specialized to receive, process, and transmit information in milliseconds through electrical and chemical signals. A fun fact, humans have over 86 billion neurons. Let's look at the parts of a neuron. A typical neuron is composed of three main parts: the soma, the dendrites, and the axon. The soma, or the cell body, contains the nucleus and other essential organelles necessary for the neuron survival. And then branching out of the soma are numerous extensions called dendrites. And dendrites receive signals from other neurons and relay them to the soma. The neuron also has a long, slender projection called the axon, which extends from the soma and is responsible for transmitting the electrical signal or action potential away from the cell body. Many axons are covered with a myelin sheath, which helps to speed up signal conduction. And at the very end of an axon, we have the axon terminals, which release neurotransmitters into synaptic gaps and enables communication with neighboring cells. So, how exactly does the neuron communicate? Neurons communicate through a process called synaptic transmission, and this involves both electrical and chemical signals. This communication typically occurs in two main phases: electrical conduction within the neuron and chemical transmission between neurons. The process of communication begins when a neuron receives a signal from another neuron or sensory input through its dendrites. If the incoming signal is strong enough to reach a certain threshold, it triggers an electrical impulse that travels along the axon. This is called the action potential. Once this is initiated, the action potential travels down the axon towards the axon terminals. When the action potential reaches the end of the axon, it arrives at a structure called the synapse or the synapse, which is a small gap between the communication neuron and the next cell. Here, the electrical signal is then converted into a chemical signal. This chemical signal causes vesicles in the axon terminal to release chemical messengers called neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. These neurotransmitters cross the synapse and bind to specific receptors on the surface of the next neuron's dendrites. This binding can either excite or inhibit the receiving neuron, depending on the type of neurotransmitter and receptor involved. If the signal is excitatory and strong enough, it may trigger a new action potential in the receiving neuron, continuing the chain of communication. It may trigger a new action potential in the receiving neuron, continuing the chain of communication. If it is inhibitory, the opposite will happen. This electrochemical signaling process enables everything from simple reflexes to complex thoughts, emotions, and memory, and it forms the basis of how the nervous system functions. Some examples of neurotransmitters include dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, and etc. Let's look at the characteristics of neurons. Neurons can be excited. Neurons can detect and respond to various stimuli, example, touch, light, and chemicals, by generating electrical signals known as action tensions. Another characteristic is conductivity. Once stimulated, neurons can transmit electrical impulses rapidly and precisely along their membrane and to other cells. Longevity. Most neurons last a lifetime. Unlike many other cells, they are not routinely replaced, especially in the central nervous system. Neurons are mitotic in nature. Mature neurons typically do not undergo mitosis. So after development, they lose the ability to divide and regenerate. Neurons also have high metabolic rates. Neurons require a constant supply of oxygen and glucose to maintain their function as they consume a significant amount of energy in the body. Another characteristic is polarity. Neurons have a clear structural and functional polarity. So, due to this, dendrites can receive signals and axons can transmit them. They also have synaptic transmission. Neurons can communicate with each other and with effector cells like muscles or glands via synapses using neurotransmitters. Let's look at the types of neurons that we have. Not all neurons are the same. They differ based on their roles within the nervous system. So, based on this, neurons can be classified into two main ways: structurally and functionally. Structurally, they can be classified by the number of processes extending from their soma. So, under this classification, we have multipolar neurons, and this is when one axon has many dendrites. A common example is the brain and spinal cord. We also have bipolar neurons. This is when a neuron has one axon and one dendrite, and it's usually found in sensory organs like retina. Then finally, we have unipolar or pseudo unipolar neurons. And this is when a neuron has a single process that divides into two branches. So that is an axon that extends into dendrites. It's usually found in sensory neurons of the peripheral nervous system. Functionally, there are three main types of neurons. We have sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. Sensory neurons, also called afferent neurons, are neurons that receive sensory information from the periphery and transmit it to the nervous system, so the brain and spinal cord. And examples include neurons in the eyes that detect light or neurons in the skin that can sense touch. Motor neurons or efferent neurons are neurons that transmit signals from the central nervous system to effector organs such as muscles and glands and initiate movement or secretion. An example is a neuron signaling the bicep muscle to contract. And then finally, we have interneurons or relay neurons. These neurons are located within the central nervous system and act as intermediaries between sensory and motor neurons. So they are very important for complex processing such as reflexes, decision making, and learning. Let's look at some functions of the neurons. Neurons have five main functions in the body. So reception, integration, conduction, response, and coordination. For reception, neurons detect changes in the environment using sensory receptors. For integration, They process incoming information to generate appropriate responses. Conduction. Neurons transmit nerve impulses over long distances. Response. Neurons can activate muscles or glands to execute actions. And then coordination. Neurons work in networks to synchronize body activities like breathing, walking, or thinking. Let's look at a real life example of how neurons come together to work. So we can see this in a simple reflex like touching a hot surface. When we touch a hot surface, sensory neurons in the skin detect the heat and send a signal to the interneurons in the spinal cord. These interneurons then activate motor neurons, which signal your muscles to withdraw your hand. Remember, all this is happening within milliseconds. On a more complex level, we have a number of networks of interneurons in the brain that are responsible for higher order functions like thought, memory, and language. So basically, every sensation, every movement, every thought is as a result of a complex interplay of neurons. So that's it for this video. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. On our next video, we'll explain the synapse.